I felt a cold shiver of fear. Josh and I turned around, keeping Andy in between us. This time I was sure we were dead. Get over here, Officer Parsons ordered. Still holding on to Andy, we stepped back toward the police car. Did I just hear him growl and bark? The police officer asked. No, sir, said Josh. That's funny, I could have sworn I heard him growl, said the police officer. That's just another part of the breathing exercise, I explained. You sort of growl in and bark out. Then to demonstrate, I took a deep breath, making a weird growling sound, and then barked. Officer Parsons looked at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Just then his police radio crackled on. There'd been an accident a few blocks away. And the police dispatcher asked if he could get over there fast. They'll be right there, Officer Parsons said into the mic, then looked back at us. Go home, boys. I don't want to see you again tonight. Then he flicked on his flashing lights. Screech. He left a small patch of rubber and zoomed away down the street. Andy opened his mouth again to bark, but before he could, Josh and I clamped our hands across his face and stopped him. MMHHMMF. Andy struggled against our grips. Get him inside, Josh hissed. We practically dragged him up the walk and through the front door into the house. Bang. Josh slammed the door behind us and we let go of Andy. He jumped away and faced us. Rough. Rough. He barked and shook his rear like he thought it was a game. Josh pressed his fingers into his eyes and shook his head wearily. Remind me never to get a dog. Well, at least we're okay now, I said. The words had hardly left my mouth when we heard a car pull into the driveway and two doors open and slam shut. Josh's eyes widened. It's my parents. Josh looked around in a panic. We can't let them see him. What should we do? I asked. Grab him. Josh and I got on either side of Andy, who crouched down playfully, looking left and right as if he thought we wanted to play. 1, 2, 3, now, Josh yelled. We both sprang at Andy. UNH. Crash. At the last possible second, Andy ducked and slid away. Josh and I crashed into each other and fell in a tangle to the living room floor. The front door lock clicked. The door swung open and Mr. and Mrs. Hopka started in, wearing their business clothes. Josh and I were sprawled on the floor. His parents stopped and stared at us. Josh. Mr. Hopka scowled. Oh, hi, Dad. Josh quickly untangled himself from me and stood up. Rough. Rough. Andy bounded over to the Hopkas, then started to sniff their legs. What in the world? Mrs. Hopka gasped. Oh, it's just a joke. Josh lunged for Andy, grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back. We were, just playing dog tag. Dog tag, Mr. Hopka repeated with a frown. Yeah, whoever's it has to act like a dog, Josh said, still holding Andy by the collar. Now come on, Andy, let's go. Josh started to drag Andy away toward his bedroom. Rough. Rough. With his tongue hanging out and his rear end wiggling, Andy kept trying to look back at Josh's parents. Ha ha, that's funny, Andy. Josh laughed, pretending it was just a big joke. Mr. and Mrs. Hopka stood inside the front door with bewildered looks on their faces. Then Mr. Hopka noticed me. Jake, he said, isn't it rather late for you to be out? Yeah, in fact, I was just going, I said. I'll go say goodbye to Josh and Andy. I turned and hurried down the hall, then pushed open the door to Josh's room and went in. Josh's room was small and super neat. Against one wall was a double bunk bed for sleepovers. Josh was sitting on the lower of the two bunks. Andy was sitting on the floor, panting with his tongue out. His head was tilted sideways and his back leg was bicycling as he tried to scratch his ear. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Josh groaned. I think your parents want me to leave, I said. What about him? Josh pointed at Andy. Rough. Rough. Andy barked playfully. I don't know, I said, rubbing Andy on the head. You can't just leave me like this. Josh looked desperate. Unlike Andy and me, he was an only child who'd never had a pet or a younger brother. He wasn't used to this kind of stuff. Andy rolled over on his back with his arms bent like a dog's. Now what? Josh asked. He just wants his tummy scratched, I said, bending over and scratching him. Josh shook his head wearily. What am I going to do? I rubbed my chin for a second and thought. Tell me something. Do your parents come in your room much at night? Josh shook his head. Hardly ever. Why? 5 minutes later we'd strapped Andy into the lower bunk with sheets. Josh had wrapped an ace bandage around Andy's head so that he couldn't open his mouth. Andy lay on the bunk with his bandaged head on the pillow and a dismayed look on his face. No matter where we went in the room, he followed us with his eyes. I hate to say it, but this is really cruel, I said. Maybe, but at least 111 get some sleep tonight, said Josh. Yeah, and tomorrow a thought suddenly struck me. From the expression on Josh's face, I could see that he'd just thought of it too. Tomorrow's school. We both gasped. I got back to my house a little while later. The lights were on upstairs and off downstairs, which meant everyone was getting ready to go to bed. I let myself in the front door. That you, Jake? My father called from upstairs. Yeah, I'll be up in a minute, I called back, then headed to the kitchen to see what Lance was doing. The kitchen was dark, so I reached for a switch and flicked it on. Ah, an involuntary cry of surprise burst from my lips. Lance was sitting on a chair at the kitchen table. His forelegs were on the table. He gave me a droll look, as if I were acting like a jerk. Hey, don't look at me like that, I said. I just didn't expect to find you sitting at the table, okay? You're a dog, remember? Grr. Lance bared his teeth and let a low growl escape his lips. Okay, you're really Andy, I admitted. But for now you're a dog and you're supposed to act like a dog. And as far as I know, dogs don't sit at the kitchen table in most houses. Lance sighed, then got down on the floor. He looked back over his shoulder and gestured for me to follow him around the kitchen counter. On the other side of the counter he stopped and nodded down at his food bowl, then gave me a forlorn look. The bowl was filled with round brown dog pellets. The look he gave me said, "You don't really expect me to eat this stuff, do you?" Okay, what do you want? I went over to the refrigerator and pulled it open. Groof. Groof. Lance barked. As usual, the fridge was filled with a mixture of stuff from the supermarket, as well as plastic containers of leftovers. I opened a container. Yesterday's spaghetti. Lance shook his head, so I tried another container. Tuna casserole. Lance winced. Jello. Lance lay down on the floor and covered his ears with his paws. I noticed a package and opened it. Inside was sliced roast beef. Roast beef. Lance quickly jumped to his feet and wagged his tail. Arf. I put the roast beef on a plate on the floor. Instead of eating it, Lance looked up at me sadly. Now what? I asked. He trotted over to the kitchen counter and stood up on his hind legs with his paws against the cabinet. Groof. He barked at the bread box. You want a sandwich? Arf. Dogs don't eat sandwiches, I said. Lance gave me another sad look. So I took the roast beef and put it between two slices of bread. Happy? I asked, lowering the plate in front of him. Groof. Lance went back to the refrigerator and barked at it. Let me guess, I said, opening the refrigerator door. You want a pickle? Groof. Lance shook his head. Mayo. Arf. Sai spread mayonnaise on the sandwich and put the plate back down on the floor. Happy now? I asked. Arf. Lance bent down and tried to nudge the sandwich with his nose. Then he looked up again at me. Groof. Now what? I asked. Lance nudged the sandwich with his nose. Oh, I get it. You want me to hold the sandwich so you can bite it. Arf. You're really demanding, know that. I said, but I picked up the sandwich and held it for Lance, who took a big bite. Would you mind telling me what you're doing? I looked up and found Jessica in her pink bathrobe standing over me. TTH. FM giving Lance a sandwich, I said, *J holding the half-eaten sandwich. Really? Jessica looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Any particular reason why? Well, I just thought it might be time for a change, I said. I mean, imagine being a dog and eating the same dumb dog food every day. I never thought about it, my sister said. There, you see. The only thing I see is that you're really losing it, Jake. Lance took another bite of the sandwich and ignored her. I had a feeling it was time to change the subject. Fast. So, what are you doing down here anyway? I asked. I'm going to bed. Jessica yawned. I came down to get Lance. Huh. Then I remembered. Lance slept upstairs almost every night. Oh, gee, I think that's a really bad idea tonight, I said. Why? Jessica gave me a puzzled look. Well, because, Lance has been scratching himself a lot. FM worried he might have fleas. Really? Jessica looked a little bewildered. I haven't seen him scratch himself once tonight. And he's been wearing a flea collar for months. Arf. Arf. Having finished the sandwich, Lance barked up at us happily. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if that collar's no good anymore, I said. I don't know what's with you, Jake, she said. I just put a new collar on him a few weeks ago. They're supposed to work for a whole year. Jessica kneeled down in front of Lance and took his face in her hands. Jake says you have fleas, Poochie Poo. He says my little love puppy shouldn't go upstairs tonight. Grr. Lance turned to me and growled. You don't have fleas, do you, Poochie Poo? Jessica kissed him on the head. Arf. Arf. Lance barked and wagged his tail. That's what I thought, Jessica said, straightening up. Jake's just being a weirdo, like usual. Come on, love pup, let's go. The next thing I knew, Lance followed my sister out of the kitchen. I swear that he looked back at me with a smile and winked as he left. Lance had a big grin on his face when he followed Jessica into the kitchen the next morning. I gave him a dirty look. How'd you sleep? I asked Jessica. Not so well, she said. Lance kept scratching at my door. I think he wanted to come in. You didn't let him, did you? I asked. No way. I gave Lance an angry look. He gave me a guilty look and slinked away. I'm going to talk to you later, I warned him. Then I looked up at the clock and gulped down the rest of my orange juice. Time to bail. But it's too early to go to school, Jessica said. I have to stop at Josh's on the way. The night before I'd promised him that I'd help him get Andy to school in the morning. Jessica gave me a funny look. You were there until late last night. Now you're going back first thing this morning. What's going on? Why do you think something's going on? Because you're my brother and I know you. It usually takes a national emergency to get you out of bed any earlier than necessary. Well, maybe something is going on, I said. But believe me, you'll be the last to know. I started out of the kitchen. Groof. Groof. Lance barked as if he didn't want me to go. I looked down at him, still angry that he'd tried to get into my sister's room last night. What do you want? Another roast beef sandwich, probably, Jessica said. Arf. Lance barked in agreement. Ha. I had to laugh. Guess what you can eat, you dirty dog. Dog food. Go on, Poochie Poo. Jessica pointed to Lance's food bowl, which was still full of dog food from the previous night. Time for breakfast. Groof. Lance gave me a pleading look. I just smirked. Fat chance, Poochie Poo. This time you can eat it. A little while later I got to Josh's and rang the bell. Who is it? The milkman, I said. Who do you think? Josh started to open the door. Rough. Rough. Andy raced up behind him and through the doorway. Before I could stop him, he threw his arms around my neck and started to lick my face. Oh, gross. Get off me. I pushed him away. Guess he's happy to see you. Josh grabbed Andy by the shirt collar and pulled him back into the house. Very funny. I wiped my face on my shirt sleeve. I followed them into the house and closed the door behind me. Look, as soon as school's over today, we have to get Lance and Andy over to Mr. Dirkson's and switch them back. Sounds like something happened last night, Josh said. Believe it, I replied. Lance tried to get into Jessica's room last night. Josh grinned. Hey, maybe I'll switch bodies with Lance next. You do and 111 make sure we get a doghouse. I was only kidding, Josh said. Can't you take a joke? I don't know. Guess my sense of humor is starting to wear a little thin. Well, I wouldn't let it wear too thin if I were you, Josh warned. Why not? Josh pointed at Andy, who was sitting on the floor trying to chew his own shoe. The problem was, it was still on his foot. Because now we're going to take this guy to school. The good news was that there was only half a day of school because of teachers' conferences. The bad news was that Andy would have to go. There was no way we could leave him alone at Josh's house, and no way Josh or I could get away with ditching school to keep an eye on him. Most mornings before school, my friends and I played ball in the yard while we waited for the bell to ring. Sometimes we played soccer, sometimes basketball. That morning they were playing baseball when Josh and I got there. We were a little late because Andy insisted on stopping to sniff fire hydrants on the way. Hey, come on, you guys. Alex Silver waved when he saw us. We need some more players. Behind Andy's neck, Josh had a tight grip on his shirt collar. Not today, Alex. Come on, guys, don't wimp out. Alex shouted back. We need you. Rough. Rough. Andy barked, clearly eager to join the game. Josh struggled to hold him back. Sorry, Alex, I yelled. No can do. You wusses. Alex shouted. Then he turned around and chucked the baseball high into the air. Rip. The next thing I knew, Josh was standing there holding Andy's shirt collar. Only, Andy's shirt wasn't attached to it anymore. Andy, meanwhile, was streaking toward the rolling baseball. All right, Andy. Alex cheered. Andy grabbed the ball, but instead of throwing it toward the infield, he took off in another direction, away from the field. Ever see him run that fast? Josh asked. I shook my head. Andy was really moving. Hey, come back here. Everyone started yelling. Give us the ball back, you jerk. Andy kept running. Alex turned and yelled at us, what's with that guy? He's not himself today, I said. How come he took the ball? Alex asked. Guess he wanted it, Josh said. Well, how about getting it back? You want it, Josh said. You can get it. Josh. I nudged him. What? Maybe it would be better if we got it, I said. Know what I mean? Josh and I started to jog after Andy, who had run all the way to the fence at the edge of school property. There he dropped the ball and then crouched down on the grass behind it, watching us and panting with his tongue out. Why do I feel like I've been through this before? Josh murmured as we walked across the dew-covered grass. Maybe it was a mistake to bring him to school, I muttered. You expected me to leave him tied up all day on the bunk bed? Josh asked. Why not? Well, for one thing, it's cleaning lady day. For another, I think that's pretty cruel, don't you? Who tell you when school's over, I said. Andy was still crouched behind the ball, waiting for us. What's his problem? Alex asked as he caught up to us. Don't ask, I said. Is he going to give the ball back? When he gets like this, you never know. What do you mean, when he gets like this? Alex asked. Has he gone mental or something? As we got closer, Andy rose to his feet and picked up the ball. His eyes darted around as if he was planning his next move. We better stop here, I said when we got about 30 feet away. Why? Alex asked. And why's he panting like that? You'd pant too, if you'd just run that far. Come on, Andy, give the ball back. Alex started toward Andy. Don't. I grabbed his arm. Why not? Alex asked. As long as he thinks you want it, he won't give it to you. What? Alex looked at me like I was crazy. That's just the way he is, I said. How am I going to get the ball back? Turn around and walk away like you don't care. Alex stared at me. Maybe I was wrong. It's not Andy who's gone mental, it's your just do it, said Josh. The three of us turned and started to walk away. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Andy stop panting and frown. Then he stuck his nose in the air and sniffed. Dropping the ball, he started to walk along the fence as if he was following a scent. Now's your chance, I whispered to Alex. Walk slowly toward the ball. Alex turned and started toward the ball. Meanwhile, Josh and I strolled toward Andy, who watched us warily. Now what? Josh asked out of the corner of his mouth. I reached into my pocket and took out a couple of Skittles from a pack I'd bought a few days before. Hey, Andy, look. Here, boy. I held out the candies. Andy squinted, then bounded toward me. The next thing I knew, he bent down and ate them right out of my hand. Josh winced. That is totally gross. Why can't he pick stuff up and eat it? Have you ever seen a dog pick up his food and eat it? I wiped my hand on my jeans. He's not a dog, Josh said. Andy finished the Skittles and bent down again. He stuck his nose next to my pocket and sniffed the rest. Tell him that, I said. Getting Andy through homeroom wasn't hard. All we had to do was make him stay in his seat. Josh sat on his right and I sat on his left, and we kept our fingers in his belt loops. Every time Andy tried to get up, we just pulled him back down. That was easy, I said when we got out into the hall after homeroom and started toward our next class, keeping Andy between us. Believe me, it's going to get harder, Josh said. At least it's Dirkson's class next, I said. He's always telling us we act like animals anyway. We got into the science lab. The second bell hadn't rung yet and everyone was milling around the room. We let go of Andy and he wandered toward the back of the lab, sniffing around the jars of dead bugs and animals and formaldehyde. Josh and I stood a few feet away, just in case he tried to eat something. What did you give him for breakfast? I asked. Popcorn, Josh said. What? Why? I tried to think of stuff he could just stick his face into and eat. Mr. Dirksen came into the classroom and said loudly, Okay, everyone, take your seats. Of course, no one ever listened to him. He usually had to yell at us 2 or 3 times before we do it. I said, Sit. Mr. Dirksen said even more loudly. Andy's eyes darted around nervously. Then he sat down on the nearest lab stool. Wow, he never did that at home, I said. Maybe he's finally learning, said Josh. But Andy only sat for a second. Then he got up and went back to sniffing the jars. I take it back, Josh said. This is the last time I'm going to say it, people. Mr. Dirksen announced crossly. Either sit or pay a visit to Principal Blanco's office. Everyone except Andy drifted toward their lab tables and sat on the metal stools. Josh and I both sat down and turned to each other. Where is he? I asked. I thought he was with you, Josh said. We both turned to the back of the room. Andy was back there, sniffing an old human skeleton hanging on a metal hook. Hey, Andy, come on. I hissed. Yo, dummy. Josh whispered. Andy ignored us. Ahem. Mr. Dirksen cleared his throat. Andy. Andy ignored him, too, and continued to sniff at the skeleton. Now the other kids noticed him. What's he doing? Julia Sachs asked. Looks like he's sniffing that skeleton, said Amber Sweeney. What does he think he is, a dog? Asked Alex Silver. Josh glanced at me and whispered, FM starting to get a bad feeling about this. Andy, this is my final warning, Mr. Dirksen said. Either sit or go to Principal Blanco's office. I quickly dug into my pocket and got out a few more Skittles. Hey, Andy, I hissed, holding my hand low, where Dirksen couldn't see it. Andy turned and saw the candies. He quickly joined Josh and me at our lab table. I got him to sit on the stool by holding my hand with the Skittles up high. Then I fed him. Sitting at the lab table next to us, Julia Sachs looked totally grossed out. You guys are really sick. All right, Mr. Dirksen said. Today we're going to start a new section on minerals, rocks, and gems. Now, you've probably all seen a diamond on a ring and you know it's very polished and shiny. But what does a diamond look like when it's first found in its natural environment? Mr. Dirksen looked around the room for someone to call on. Andy was sitting straight up on his stool with his mouth open and his tongue hanging out. Can you tell us, Andy? Mr. Dirksen asked. Rough. Andy barked. That's right, said Mr. Dirksen. Diamonds are rough when first found. Good boy. I patted Andy on the head and fed him a few more Skittles. Now, of course, what happens to a diamond that transforms it into the glittering gem we see in a jewelry store? Mr. Dirksen asked. Rough. Andy barked. Please don't call out, Andy, Mr. Dirksen said. Rough. Rough. Andy barked. This is my last warning, Andy. Quiet boy. I quickly pulled more Skittles out of my pocket and fed them to him. This time, Mr. Dirksen saw us. May I ask what you're doing, Jake? The whole class turned and stared at me. I glanced nervously at Josh, hoping he'd come up with some kind of excuse. But Josh bit his lip and shook his head. I'm waiting for an explanation, Jake. Mr. Dirksen crossed his arms. Well, you see, Mr. Dirksen, I said, we're doing a project in social studies where we try to look at the world through different eyes. Andy decided to look at it through a dog's eyes. Mr. Dirksen looked puzzled. Lame, Josh whispered out of the corner of his mouth. At least I tried, I whispered back. Well, he's not buying it. Why can't you come up with something? I whispered. Hey, it wasn't my idea to turn him into a dog, Josh hissed. What are you talking about? I whispered back. You're the one who threw the switch. Yeah, well, you're the bonehead who took us to Dirksen's house in the first place. Josh shot back. Big blob o' nothing, I hissed. Pseudopod, Josh hissed back. Fungus brain. Sporeface. That's enough, you two. Mr. Dirksen said sternly. If you have something to say, I suggest you say it to me. Flap. Just then one of the window shades shot up with a loud noise. Oh woo. Startled, Andy let out a howl, jumped off his stool, and tore out of the room. What the, Mr. Dirksen gasped. I'll go get him. I yelled and ran out after him. Me too, yelled Josh and followed. Three of us got sent to Principal Blanco, office. The principal was on the phone, so his white-haired secretary, Mrs. Hub, told us to sit on some wooden chairs outside his door. Andy sat between Josh and me. His tongue hung out and he was really panting hard. Nice going, Jake, Josh muttered out of the side of his mouth. I'm really getting tired of you blaming me for everything, I snapped. No talking, boys, Mrs. Hub warned. You don't want to get into any nor trouble, do you? Josh and I both shut up. Between us, Andy yawned. Then he put his head on my shoulder and closed his eyes. Cut it out, I whispered and shook my shoulder. Andy picked up his head, opened his eyes, yawned, then put his head down on Josh's shoulder. Bug off. Josh did the same thing. Andy picked his head up again and put it back on my shoulder. I would have shaken his head off again, but Mrs. Hub tipped her glasses down on her nose and stared at me. I hope you two are good mens, she said. Josh snorted and hid a grin with his hand. Just then the door to Principal Blanco's office opened and the principal stepped out. Mr. Blanco was a short, pudgy man with curly black hair and narrow eyes. He always wore a black suit and tried to act tough. Find something funny, Mr. Hopka. Recently he'd started to address the students by their last names, as if this somehow made everything more official. Josh quickly pressed his lips together and shook his head. Then Principal Blanco looked at me. Andy was still sleeping with his head on my shoulder. What's wrong with him? The principal asked. I think he's really tired, I said. Why's his shirt torn like that? Blanco asked. Jake and I shrugged. Principal Blanco shook his head in disgust. I always say you kids don't get enough sleep. What's the point of coming to school if you're too tired to pay attention? All you wind up doing is putting your head down on your desk and going to sleep. That instantly promotes a tone of disrespect toward your teacher, and subtly encourages your fellow students to misbehave. What time do you go to bed at night, Mr. Sherman? Around 11, I said. Principal Blanco nodded. Just as I expected. And what about you, Mr. Hopka? 11:30, said Josh. You see, Principal Blanco said. That proves my point. When I was your age, I was in bed by 9 every night. You kids don't get enough sleep. But we're not tired, Mr. Blanco, I said. Principal Blanco blinked. Well, you should be. And by the way, when Mr. Kent wakes up, tell him to get a new shirt. Will do, sir. Blanco straightened his tie. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an important appointment with the superintendent. The principal turned to his secretary. Take phone messages, Mrs. Hub. Tell anyone who calls that I'll get back to them after lunch. There's only half a day today, Mrs. Hub reminded him. Teachers' conferences, remember. Oh, right, in that case tell them I'll call them back tomorrow. And what about these boys? Mrs. Hub pointed at Josh, Andy, and me. The wrinkles in Principal Blanco's forehead deepened. He turned back to us. Why are you here, boys? Mr. Dirksen sent us, Josh said. Misbehaving in class, huh? The principal guessed. It was his fault. Josh and I simultaneously pointed at Andy, who still had his head on my shoulder with his eyes closed and his mouth open. Principal Blanco pursed his lips together. Well, I should probably give him a lecture, but I'm late for my appointment with the superintendent, and anyway, you know what they say about dogs. Josh and I tensed. Let sleeping dogs lie, Principal Blanco said. He turned to his secretary. I believe it was Winston Churchill who said that. Am I right, Mrs. Hub? Charles Dickens, Mrs. Hub replied tersely. Oh, well, what's the difference? The principal said with a shrug. Anyway, you boys can sit out the rest of the period here. Then proceed to your third period class. And try to get some sleep tonight, okay? Sure thing, Principal Blanco, Josh and I both said, relieved. The principal left the office. Andy twitched in his sleep and stretched his legs and arms straight out from the chair. Mrs. Hub tipped down her glasses and studied him. Is he all right? She asked. Just tired, I said. Dog tired, Josh added. T can't believe we made it through the whole morning, I said. Josh and I were walking home. Josh was holding Andy by what was left of his shirt collar. Rough. Andy stopped next to a fire hydrant and tried to bend down to sniff it, but Josh yanked him back up. We may have made it through this morning, but I'm not sure how much more of this I can take, Josh moaned. All we have to do is get Lance and Andy over to Mr. Dirksen's garage and switch them back, I said. Give me about 20 minutes while I go home and get Lance. Okay, Josh said. FLL just stop at my house to dump my books. I got home and let myself in. I could hear the TV in the den. I went in and found Lance sitting on the couch watching a talk show. Having fun? I asked. Lance shrugged and kept watching the TV. I guess watching TV doesn't compare with trying to get into my sister's room, huh? I asked. Lance shrugged. You're a real dog, know that. I said. Anyway, it's time to switch you back to your own body. Josh is going to meet us at Mr. Dirksen's. Lance just stared at the TV and didn't budge. Did you hear me? I said we're going to get you back into your body again. Lance reached down to the remote lying on the couch beside him. He pressed one of the buttons with his paw nail and the volume went up. What are you doing? I asked. Lance gave me a look that said, it's obvious, isn't it? I'm watching TV. But we've got to get you back into your body, I said. Lance responded with a yawn. His eyes remained glued to the screen. I went over and pressed the power button on the TV, turning it off. Come on, I'm serious. Click. The TV went back on. Lance did it with the remote. Click. I turned it off again. Click. He turned it on again. What's with you? I asked, turning the TV off again. Click. Lance turned it back on. This is ridiculous. I stepped toward the couch and reached for the remote. Grr. Lance bared his teeth and growled at me. I stopped. Lance turned back to the TV. I took another step and reached for the remote again. Grr. Lance bared his teeth and growled again. I can't believe you, I said. You actually want to stay in a dog's body. The talk show went to commercials. Lance pressed his nail against the remote and turned down the volume. Then he looked at me and nodded. But you can't. I gasped. You have an obligation to your body. Your parents are coming home tonight. What do you think is going to happen when they figure out that their son has the mind of a 1-year-old Labrador retriever? Lance shrugged and glanced at the TV as if making sure the talk show hadn't come back on. I can't believe this, I groaned. How can you want to stay in a dog's body? Lance gave me a look that said, why not? I stared at him, reclining there on the couch. Maybe it wasn't so hard to understand. If he stayed a dog, he didn't have to go to school. He could lie around the house all day and watch TV. He could play and sleep and do whatever he wanted. It wasn't fair. Forget it, I snarled. No way. Brian, the phone rang. You hear me? I fumed. You're not going to get away with this. The talk show came back on. Lance pressed the remote and the volume went back up. Brian, I almost told Lance not to go anywhere, but it didn't seem necessary. I went into the kitchen and answered the phone. Jake, it's Josh. Hi, I said. I guess you're wondering why I'm not at Mr. Dirkson's. Well, I'm having a problem with Lance. He doesn't want to go. Neither does Andy. Why won't Andy go? I asked. Well, we got back to my house and he saw a squirrel. So, he's seen squirrels before. I know, but he's never chased one up a tree before, Josh said. Sure he has. He always chases them up trees. But he doesn't usually follow them. What? Dogs don't climb trees, I said. Maybe not, but dogs in human bodies do, said Josh. Anyway, once he got up the tree, he must have remembered that he was a dog. So now he's freaked because he can't figure out how to get back down. Can't you help him? I tried, but he won't let go of the branch he's on, Josh said. Anyway, what's up with Lance? He doesn't want to go back into his old body. Why not? Because this way he doesn't have to go to school. He can just lie around all day and watch TV and sleep. I don't blame him. Neither do I, but I'd rather have my dog back. So what are you going to do? Josh asked. I don't know, I said. Guess I'll have to think of something. Meanwhile, I'll come over and help you get Andy out of the tree. Take your time, Josh said. Why? Because if we're not going to switch them, I'd just as soon leave him there for a while. Believe me, I could use a break. I went back to the den. Lance was still watching TV. Let me ask you something, I said. What do you think is going to happen when Jessica and my parents come home? You think they won't notice that you're sitting on the couch with the remote? Lance ignored me. What are you going to do when my mother tells you to get off the couch? I asked. You going to bare your teeth and growl at her? You know what she'll do. She'll take you to the pound and leave you there for good. Lance gave me a look like I was being an idiot. Oh, I get it, I said. You've already thought of all this stuff. You figure all you have to do is act like a dog when they're around and everything will be cool, right? And as soon as they leave for school and work, you'll be back in the couch watch. Ing the tube. Without taking his eyes off the TV, Lance smiled and nodded. Well, I'll tell you one thing, dude, you can forget about me giving you anything good to eat, I said. You want to be a dog. Fine, you can eat dog food. Lance just shrugged. Apparently he'd already thought about that too, and was willing to accept it. I tried every argument I could think of. I reminded him that a dog lives roughly 7 years for each human year and that by the time I was in my 20s he'd be a rickety old mutt. I reminded him that he'd never get his driver's license or be able to vote. I talked about all the parties and ball games he'd miss. But nothing I said made a dent. Andy had decided to spend the rest of his life as a dog. After a while, we heard the front door click. Lance quickly turned off the TV and got down off the couch. He trotted toward the door, reaching it just as Jessica let herself in. Oh, look who's here. It's my little love puppy. Groof. Groof. Lance barked happily. Jessica rubbed his head affectionately. My little Poochie Poo missed me. How sweet. Meanwhile, Lance turned to me and grinned as if he was saying, see. I know how to act like a dog when I have to. Mom and Dad are coming home late tonight, Jessica said when she saw me. Mom said I should make some frozen pizzas for dinner. It didn't take long for her to heat up the pizzas. Just before we sat down to eat, Jessica filled Lance's bowl with dog food. Lance seemed pretty reluctant to eat it. I watched as he sniffed it and sort of grimaced. Then he looked over his shoulder at me with a pleading look, as if to say, please help me out of this. I shook my head and gave him a look that said, no way, dude. You want to live like a dog, you're going to eat like one, too. Lance narrowed his eyes and silently bared his teeth at me. Then in defiance, he plunged his snout into the dog food and started to eat. He gobbled it all down pretty quickly, the same way I used to eat broccoli, like he wanted to get it over with fast. When the bowl was empty, he looked up at me again. I pointed a finger into my mouth like I wanted to make myself barf. What are you doing? Jessica asked. Huh. I quickly spun around in my seat. Oh, nothing. Across the kitchen, Lance gave me a smug smile. Oh, Poochie Poo, come here. Jessica held out her arms toward Lance, who trotted over. My sister gave him a big hug and rubbed him on his head. You are the best dog in the world, know that. Jessica bent her head down and Lance licked her face and ears. That's right, my big Poochie Poo love puppy, only she knew, I thought with a groan. Lance opened his mouth and panted. He grinned at me like he knew what I was thinking. I could see that he loved taunting me. Jessica hugged him again. Yes, this is my big boy, my Poochie Poo, she said in that dumb lovey-dovey voice. And you know what I did today, my big brave love pup. Groof. Lance barked happily. Man, what a life. Never going to school, watching TV all the time, having my sister slobber all over him. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was better to be a dog. Today, my sister continued, I made an appointment for you to go to Groomingdale's. The furrows in Lance's forehead deepened slightly. He glanced questioningly at me. That's the dog grooming place in town, I said. Lance turned to Jessica and gave her an apprehensive look. You see, Lance, my little love pup, my sister said. You're getting to be a big grown-up boy now and I've noticed that you smell a little cheesy. And sometimes you scratch people by accident. Now, don't get upset, it's perfectly natural. Jessica paused and pretended to sniff as if the thought of Lance smelling saddened her, but we can't have Dad complaining about how you smell. Or that your nails are too long, so guess what? Lance's eyes grew wide with terror. We're going to have you washed, clipped, and perfumed, Jessica said. I thought Lance's eyes were going to bulge right out of his head. Washed and perfumed. He must have been thinking. Does she mean, bathed and smelling like a girl? Oh woo. Lance let out a howl. The next thing I knew, he clamped his teeth around the cuff of my pants and started to pull as hard as he could. What's with him? Jessica asked. I think he must really want to go for a walk, I said, getting up. Arf. Arf. Lance let go of my leg and barked eagerly. I got his leash. Since when do you like taking him for walks? Jessica asked skeptically. Hey, why not? I said. Maybe I'll take him for a long walk. It's a nice evening. What are you talking about? It's raining. I looked out the kitchen window. She was right. The sky was gray and rain was splattering against the glass. Well, I still feel like taking a walk, I said. Jessica gave me a strange look. Be my guest. I went down to the front closet and got out a jacket with a hood. Then I clipped the leash to Lancel's collar and we went out. Guess you had a change of heart, huh? I said as we quickly walked through the rain toward Josh's house. Lance didn't answer or even look at me. He just pulled as hard as he could on the leash, as if he couldn't wait to get to Mr. Dirkson's and switch back into Andy's body. Nah, maybe you're right, I said, slowing down. Maybe you should stay in Lance's body. Lance turned around, bared his teeth at me, and growled. Oh, yeah, Mr. Tough guy, I taunted him. I'm starting to think your bark is worse than your bite. Before I had time to react, Lance clamped his sharp teeth around my ankle. He squeezed just hard enough to let me know he was serious. Then he let go. On the other hand, I said as we started to walk again. I'd sort of like to get the old Andy back, too. We got to Josh's house and I rang the doorbell. Josh pulled open the door and looked surprised. Jake, what are you doing here? Lance had a sudden change of heart, I said. He wants to be Andy again. Josh looked down at Lance. What happened? I thought you liked being a dog. Groof. Lance barked. I think he liked it until Jessica decided it was time to have him groomed, I said. Josh grinned. So where's Andy? I asked. Oh, out back. You mean outside? I said. It's raining. Dogs stay outside, Josh said sheepishly. He's not a dog, he's Andy Kent, your friend, I said, and started across the wet grass toward the back of the house. Josh grabbed a jacket and caught up to me. Maybe he is my friend, but it's a real pain to keep him in the house, okay. He chews on all the furniture, he makes a mess when he eats, and he's always going in and out anyway. Andy was sitting about 12 feet up in a tree in Josh's backyard. His clothes were soaked, his hair was plastered down on his head, and rainwater was running down his face. He was hugging himself and shivering. His teeth were even chattering. I turned to Josh. I can't believe you left him out here. What were you going to do, leave him out all night? At least I knew he wouldn't go anywhere, Josh said with a shrug. Rough. Andy barked plaintively at me. He must have been freezing to death. Let's get a ladder and bring him down, I said. Josh went back to the house. I could imagine how Andy wound up in the tree. He must have been so excited about chasing the squirrel that he'd scrambled right up the branches without thinking. But once he'd gotten up there, he'd had no idea how to get down. Josh came back with a long aluminum extension ladder. We placed it against the tree so that it reached Andy. Okay, Andy, I yelled. All you have to do is climb down this ladder. Andy stayed huddled in the branches above, probably shivering as much from fear as from the cold. It occurred to me that he had no idea what a ladder was. Come on, I urged him. He wouldn't budge. You have to come down, I said. Andy just whimpered. Guess I have to go up and get him, I said and started up the ladder. When I got to Andy, I reached up and tried to grab his ankle. He yanked it away. You can't stay here, I said. If you come down, you can switch bodies with Lance. Groove. Below me, Lance barked. Rough. Andy barked back at him, but still wouldn't budge. I looked back down at Josh. Any ideas? We could cut the tree down, Josh said. With Andy in it. I raised an eyebrow. He could be killed. Josh shrugged. It was just an idea. Groove. Lance barked excitedly. What's he saying? Josh asked. How would I know? I asked. Rough. Andy barked back at Lance. Groove. Lance barked excitedly and wagged his tail. Arf. Andy barked. Groove. Lance barked. Arf. Andy stuck his foot toward me. Wow, I think he wants you to help him come down, Josh said. Lance must have talked him into it. I guided Andy's foot to a lower branch, and then his other foot to the top of the ladder. Rough. Andy barked nervously. That's a boy, you're doing fine, I reassured him. Rough. Andy barked uncertainly and came down slowly. Soon he had both feet on the ladder, then both hands. Josh reached up and helped him put one foot below the other while I held him steady. Finally he reached the ground. Groove. Lance barked at him. Andy turned to me. Rough. He barked and pawed at my pocket with his hand. Suddenly I realized why he'd come down from the tree. You told him I'd give him Skittles. I said to Lance. Arf. Lance barked and nodded. Hey, smart dog, Josh said. He's Andy, not a dog, I said. Rough. Andy swiped at my pocket again. Hey, sorry, bud, but I ran out, I said. Rough. Andy looked surprised and disappointed. Groove. Lance barked angrily at me as if he was ticked off that I hadn't brought any Skittles. If you're so smart, how come you didn't bring any? I asked. Groove. Lance barked. I don't care if you're a dog, I said. You could have taken some money and gone to the store. Groove. Lance barked and shook his head. That's not true, I argued. They'd sell Skittles to an amoeba if he had the money. Amoebas aren't really male or female, Josh reminded me. They're just its. Remember we learned that in school. Thank you for that enlightening information, I grumbled. Meanwhile, Andy's parents are going to be home in an hour, and they're going to find out that while their son stayed at your house he learned to chew on shoes and chase squirrels. Somehow I don't think they're going to be real thrilled. Hey, I'm not the one who insisted on showing everyone that dumb experiment, Josh yelled. I was tempted to yell back at him, but I caught myself. Don't you ever get tired of blaming everyone? I mean, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. The only thing that matters is fixing it before it gets worse. Yeah, well, it's still not my fault. Josh insisted. He just didn't get it. Groove. Lance stepped between us and barked. What did he say? Josh asked. I'm not sure, but it was probably something like, shut up and stop arguing because what's going to happen to us is nothing compared to what's going to happen to him if we don't get him switched. Arf. Lance nodded emphatically. We started toward Mr. Dirkson's house with Andy and Lance. What if Dirkson's home? Josh asked as we walked down the street. We'll just have to tell him what happened, I said. Given the choice, I'd rather face him than Andy's parents. Good point, Josh agreed. But Mr. Dirkson wasn't there. It had started raining harder and we could hear the distant crash of thunder and see the flicker of far-off lightning. Come on. I pulled open the garage door and let everyone in. Then I pulled it down and turned on the light inside. Now what? Josh asked. I pointed at one of the cages. Lance, get in that cage. Arf. Lance did as he was told. What about Andy? Josh asked. Andy was on the other side of the garage, sniffing Mr. Dirkson's garbage cans. Outside, a bolt of lightning lit up the sky. Boom. Thunder crashed. The light bulb in the garage flickered. Storm's coming closer, Josh said nervously. Get Andy, I said. Put him near the cage. When I count to 3, push him toward the cage and jump back. This better work, Josh muttered as he went to get Andy. Hey, I said. It can't get any worse. Lance waited in his cage. Josh brought Andy over to the other cage. Andy's tongue was hanging out and he was panting. You know, it's too bad we have to switch them, Josh said. I'm kind of getting used to Andy like this. I may even like him better this way. Forget it, I said. His parents'll kill you. Okay, 1 and 2 and 3, now. Josh gave Andy a shove toward the cage and I pulled down the big red switch. Kaboom! Just at that moment, a huge flash of lightning lit up the garage and a giant clap of thunder crashed above. The garage went dark and filled with vapor and heavy fog. For a moment I couldn't see anything. Jake, you okay? Josh called through the mist. Yeah, you. Asterisk, yeah. Groof. Who was that? Josh asked. Andy. I said. Huh, Andy, that you. I stretched out my arms and tried to feel my way through the thick dark mist. Huh. The light went back on and the vapor started to disappear. Through the mist I could see Andy, only he didn't look exactly like Andy. His face sort of came to a point and the end of his nose was black. His hands looked like a dog's paws without the fur. Oh, no, Josh gasped. I spun around and looked at Lance, whose dog face was squashed flat. His paws were huge and sort of resembled furry human hands and feet. Josh and I gaped at each other in amazement. Andy, I said. Huh, he seemed really out of it. I turned to Lance. Here, Lance. Huh, Lance seemed pretty out of it too. What's with them? Josh asked. I'm not sure, I said, but I have a funny feeling they're both like, half human, half dog. Oh, great, Josh groaned. And I thought you said it couldn't get worse. Something must have happened to the electricity because of the storm, I said. So what do we do now? Josh asked. Try again, I guess. Wait a minute. Josh hesitated. What if it gets even worse? I mean, what if Andy gets Lance's tail next? Or Lance gets Andy's head? We're supposed to be switching their minds, not their body parts. You want to leave them like this? I asked. Lance was staring down at one of his large hand-shaped paws with a perplexed look on his squashed face. Andy was trying to scratch his left ear with one of his paw hands. You're right, Josh said. Let's get him back to the cages. We put Lance and Andy in the cages again. Outside the thunder was still crashing. Here goes nothing. I pulled down the switch. Whomp. This time there was a huge flash and a killer jolt. Once again the room filled with mist. Josh, I said. I'm here, Josh replied. Andy. Huh, not again, Josh groaned. Not what again? A voice asked. That you, Josh? I said. No, I thought it was you, said Josh. It was me, the voice said. Who? I asked. Andy. Groof. Who said that, Evie? Josh asked. Groof. Sounds like Lance, I said. Hey, guys, I think you did it, Andy said. I'm back. The fog in the garage began to clear. Andy was standing near his cage. Wow, guys, can you believe it? I was Lance. Josh and I nodded, dumbfounded. I mean, what a trip, Andy was saying. To tell you the truth, it wasn't so bad. I mean, dog food's a lot better than you might think. Josh and I nodded, still speechless. Andy frowned. What's with you guys? Everything's turned out fine. How come you're not talking? Josh and I glanced nervously at each other. You want to tell him? Josh asked. No, you tell him, I said. What are you talking about? Andy asked. You tell him, Jake, Josh said. None of this would have happened if it wasn't for you. What difference does it make now? I asked. FM just saying, if anyone tells him, it should be you, Josh said. That's the dumbest logic FVE ever heard, I said. It makes absolutely no sense. Guys, Andy shouted. What do you have to tell me? Go on. Josh pointed at me. I turned to Andy. Well, it's not really a big deal. You could always have plastic surgery, Josh suggested. Andy started to look pale. Why? What's wrong? Well, it's your ears, I said. My ears. Andy felt his ears. They were long, and pointed, and covered with short yellow fur. And they hung down to his chin. LH, no. Andy gasped. Be greater than our groove. Barked Lance. We all turned and looked at him. He looked mostly like Lance, except for his ears, which were small, pink, and human-shaped. You have to do something. Andy insisted desperately. I don't know, Andy, Josh said, rubbing his chin. It's sort of an interesting look. They could always use you on Star Trek, one said. This isn't funny, guys. Andy gasped. Actually, it is pretty humorous, Josh said. Think of how many earrings you could hang on those things, I said. Yuck, yuck, Andy laughed sourly. You guys are a real scream. Now how about it? It took a few moments to get Lance back to his cage. He was pretty much a dog again, and just wanted to play. Fortunately, the garage door was down and he couldn't run away. Ready, I yelled when FD got him into the cage. Josh pulled on the switch. Whomp. Another lethal jolt filled the garage with mist. When it cleared, Andy was standing there feeling his ears. How do they look? He asked anxiously. They're okay, I said. Andy had his old ears back. You swear? I swear. Groof. Groof. Lance scratched at the garage door and wagged his tail. He wanted to go out. Looks like it stopped raining, Josh said. I checked my watch. Yeah, and Andy's parents are going to be at your house any minute. W headed back to Josh's house. Wow, guys, I still can't believe I was a dog, Andy was saying. Well, the important thing is that you're okay and back to normal, I said, slapping him on the back. You are back to normal, right? Rough. Andy barked. Josh and I froze and gave each other horrified looks. Hey, come on. Andy grinned. It was just a joke. Josh and I relaxed. Phew, you really had us going there for a second, I said, breathing a sigh of relief. You guys. Andy smiled, but then he stopped and stuck his nose up in the air. What is it? Josh asked. Don't you smell it? Andy said, quickly looking around. Smell what? A squirrel. Andy raced across the street and chased a squirrel up a tree. He pressed his hands against the tree trunk and stared up. Josh and I laughed. Very funny, Josh yelled. Yeah, I joined in. You're a regular comedian. But Andy didn't move from the tree. Then I noticed that Lance was sitting at the end of the leash and didn't seem to smell anything. And he hadn't stopped to sniff any hydrants on the way home either. Okay, Andy, Josh yelled. We got the joke. Come on, dude, we better get back to my house before your parents get there. Andy came back toward us and we started walking to Josh's house again. Wow, I can't believe you guys couldn't smell that squirrel, Andy said. Believe me, Andy, Josh said. We got the joke the first time. It was no joke, guys, Andy insisted. Who cares anyway? Josh asked. It was just a squirrel. Andy made a face like Josh couldn't be serious. Josh and I traded a furtive glance. You sure he's back to normal? Josh whispered. Just then we heard the far-off bark of a dog a few blocks away. Andy stopped and I could have sworn his ears perked up. At that same moment, Lance just yawned and didn't seem to care at all. I wouldn't have thought much about it, except that when Lance yawned, he held his paw up to his mouth. You really had to wonder.